So last week I began sort of a little sub-series in our ongoing discussion of political theology. And I began turning to the issue of equality and the concept of egalitarianism. One of the several ideas that I discussed last time was that of fairness. And I explained that in classical and Christian thought, fairness is treating equals equally and treating unequals unequally. For example, to take a really clear example of this, a child and an adult are not equal with respect to age. And age is relevant to how we treat people. Adults should not treat children as equals. They should treat them as unequals. So when a 6-year-old complains that it's unfair that he can't stay up late with the adults, the obvious answer is to say, "You're 6 years old. Go to bed." But it would be unfair and pretty odd if an adult told another adult to go to bed. That would be treating equals unequally. Now, people differ from each other in numerous ways. We differ in our beliefs, levels of intelligence, life experience, talents, moral character, and so on. We're not equal in countless ways. And some of these differences or inequalities are in fact relevant to how we treat people. We treat people differently because they are different. Historically, Christians believe that there was a long list of relevant differences on the basis of which it's okay to treat people differently. As noted, differences in age are obviously relevant. So are differences in sex. They were deemed relevant. Men are not women and women are not men, and men should treat women differently than the way they treat men. Differences in sexuality were relevant. Sodomy was once criminalized and socially stigmatized. Differences in religion were relevant. Christians and Muslims and atheists are not equal with respect to their foundational beliefs about God, human nature, sin, salvation, society, law, government. And these differences in belief were thought to matter. Atheists, in fact, were not allowed to hold public office for a long, long time in Western culture. In general, differences in beliefs and character and conduct are relevant to how we treat one another. Many of these differences become grounds for what we call just discrimination. One of the claims I made last week is that we have to recover the virtue of discrimination. It's not a bad word in traditional thought. We have to have the rational virtue of distinguishing between things that ought to be distinguished. And it's also a moral virtue to then choose to act in light of that knowledge by treating people differently. Egalitarianism has put an end to that rational view of the world. Egalitarianism is all about treating unequals equally. For the egalitarian, many of the most important differences between people are no longer allowed to count. In the last sermon, I cited the Canadian Human Rights Commission and their definition of discrimination. I'll read it again. Discrimination means treating someone unfairly because of one of their protected personal characteristics. Then they identify these protected traits: race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, marital status, family status, disability, criminal record, and so on and so forth. There's really only one trait on this list that is not relevant to how we treat people, and that's color. But even then, this is really only a general rule. The color of one's skin can become relevant. If you're a movie director casting someone to play the role of Martin Luther King, you're probably not going to invite white actors to try out. A rational society would say that all of those so-called protected traits, with the general exception of color, are relevant to how we treat people. They should be relevant. Egalitarianism says no, they're all about making those relevant differences irrelevant. And this is what I meant when I said that they tried to level or flatten the social order. But it's more than that. Egalitarianism is also a political theory. It uses the power of government to punish people for discriminating on the basis of those protected traits. It means prohibiting people from making those traits relevant in who they hire, who they fire, who they promote, or in whether they admit them into schools or into social clubs. Egalitarians want to use the power of government to bulldoze, to steamroll the natural distinctions and hierarchies that God has built in to human nature and society. As I said last week, egalitarianism did more than any other philosophy, arguably, to destroy Christendom, by which I mean the traditional social and political order of Christian Europe and of the 13 colonies in the United States. At the heart of egalitarianism is the vague idea that all people should be treated equally, regardless of all of those differences I've mentioned above. It doesn't matter if they're men or women, Muslim or Christian, legal citizen or illegal, sexually chaste or sexually deviant, everyone is to be treated equally. Egalitarians often answer this question of what it looks like to treat everyone equally by saying that we should treat everyone with equal respect. Equal respect. But what in the world does that mean? Does that mean an elder should treat a child with the same respect that a child should treat an elder? Does that mean that a captain in the U.S. Navy should treat a newly enlisted sailor with the same respect that he treats a 3-star admiral? Does that mean that a police officer should treat a vile, deranged, drugged-out gangbanger with the same respect that the gangbanger should treat the officer? The Apostle Paul said to give honor to whom honor is due. And honor is not due to everyone. Paul spoke of people who dishonor themselves by their depravity and who do not deserve to be honored. To honor such people is to violate classical justice by treating unequals equally. For the sake of argument, though, let's just say that egalitarians can devise some clear, coherent answer to the question of what it looks like to treat all people equally. They must still answer a much deeper and much more important question, namely, why? Why should we treat everyone equally? Throughout most of history, as I'll argue next time, people did not believe this claim that we should treat everyone equally. They thought that was insane. So why should we believe that now? Well, there's really only one conceivable answer to this question at a very high level, and that is only if people are, in fact, equal. Let's go back to the classical definition of fairness. Equals are to be treated equally. So, if that's true, and if all people are equal, then yeah, all people should be treated equally. So if we consider that in the abstract, it makes sense. But the problem is we don't live in the abstract. We live in the real world where people are different, really, really different from each other. We differ in countless ways. You subtract all those differences, what's left over? Take away IQ differences, take away moral differences, take away gender differences, take away financial differences, take away legal differences, take away all these differences. What's left over? That's the million-dollar question for the egalitarian. And if he cannot answer that, his entire system collapses. In fact, I will argue he can't answer that question. And I want to try to explain here very carefully what the problem is for him, okay? The egalitarian must check 4 boxes. First, the egalitarian must identify a universal human trait, a trait that all humans have and with respect to which all humans are equal. That's box 1. Second, this must be a uniquely human trait. That is, a trait that only humans have. It must not be something that non-humans have. For example, it's true that all humans are living organisms, but so are weeds, and we rip them out of the ground. It's also true that humans are sentient. We have senses. We're capable of feeling pleasure and pain, but so are animals. And yet we use them as clothing. We barbecue them. So the egalitarian must identify a trait that's both universal to all humans and unique to humans alone. This is box 2. Third, this trait must also be shared by all humans in equal measure. It must not be had in different degrees, such that some people have more of it and some people have less of it. If the trait came in unequal amounts, distributed unequally among people, the obvious conclusion is you could justify treating people differently, unequally, based on how much of that trait they have. To take an example, if physical strength gave us the right to equal respect, or the right to respect, I should say, because it wouldn't be equal, well then Monty would deserve the most respect probably in this congregation. If looks were the criterion for the right to respect, JC would get the most respect. But obviously, this would not be egalitarian. That's not egalitarian, right? The egalitarian wants to have us all enjoy equal respect, equal consideration, and so he must identify a trait that's shared by all people in equal measure. That's box 3. Fourth and finally, the trait in question must also be morally relevant. This is really important to get. That is, there must be something about the trait that explains why we should treat all people equally. Not just any trait will do the job. For example, humans have chins, and only humans have chins. Chins in the sense of things that protrude off the bottom of your face, right? Now, chins, though, aren't really relevant to how we should treat people. I wish they were, because then I would be in a privileged class. I would probably be higher caste, based on my chin. The liberals would accuse me of having chin privilege, I'm guessing. But chins just aren't morally relevant to how we should treat people. So you have to check each one. Checking just 1, checking just 2, checking just 3 will not work. All 4 have to be checked to justify egalitarianism. And the question becomes, can they do that? Well, it's going to depend on your worldview. I'm going to argue later that they can't, but Christians can check all 4 boxes. Let me explain this. According to Christianity, all men are made in God's image. This is referred to in Latin, kids, as the imago Dei, the image of God. And the image of God is a universal trait. Okay, it's universal. All men have it. Genesis 1 says, "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them, all people. All people. This checks box 1. Second, the imago Dei is a uniquely human trait. The creation narrative makes it clear that man alone is made in God's image. As the very next verse says, this is exactly why we have rule over the animals. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and over every living thing that moves on the earth. Moreover, it's had in equal measure by all humans. Though man's fall into sin has corrupted human nature and obscured the image of God in us, we do not lose it. We don't lose that. To lose the image of God would be to lose your humanity altogether. So this checks box 3. And then finally, fourthly, it's relevant, morally relevant to how we should treat people. The image of God is, all right? Genesis 9:6 says this, whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall their blood be shed, for, premise, in the image of God has God made mankind. This is how Christians explain the sanctity of human life. As God's image bearers, we are sacrosanct. That comes from a Latin word which means protected by religious sanction. Men are morally immune from being arbitrarily harmed or killed. Murder is evil because it's an essentially religious offense. It's like burning God in effigy. Similarly, in James 3:9, he says this, with the tongue we bless our Lord and Father, and with it we curse men, who have been made in God's likeness. Brothers, this should not be. You see, the Christian worldview provides a philosophically sound reason for why all men should be treated equally, at least in some minimal sense, some negative sense of not murdering them or cursing them. But can egalitarians check all 4 boxes? The answer, I say, is no. Now, at this point, you might be expecting me to go ahead and explain why, but this is where your homework comes in, all right? So I want to encourage all of you to think between now and my next sermon about whether you can check all 4 boxes without using the Christian worldview. Can you think of anything, any trait, that checks all 4 boxes apart from the image of God? I'm going to argue you can't. In the remainder of this sermon, I want to change the focus a little bit and address a related but distinct issue. One of the greatest paradoxes, in my opinion, is that egalitarianism, which is anti-Christian at its core, is a philosophy that was made possible by Christianity. The reason has a lot to do with this doctrine of the image of God. This doctrine of the imago Dei was, in a sense, turned against us, turned against Christianity by humanists during the Enlightenment of the 18th century and beyond. Those anti-Christian philosophers began to genetically re-engineer the doctrine of the image of God. So kids, some of you may or may not know that scientists have taken natural God-given seeds, such as wheat or rice, and then altered their DNA in order to give them a new feature, a new property. They've altered some seeds to become, for example, resistant to certain kinds of insects or pests. Scientists then reintroduced those modified seeds back into the environment, where they're allowed to reproduce and multiply and to create new crops. These genetically modified seeds, wheat, for example, still look like wheat and taste like wheat, but they're really a different kind of organism in a sense. And in some cases, it's resulted in harm to people, these modified versions. Well, in a similar way, anti-Christian philosophers have genetically re-engineered the doctrine of the image of God. They've modified it by changing what it means to be equal. In a sense, secular egalitarians have used Christianity to curtail Christianity's cultural influence by taking Christian language of equality before God and then infusing it with anti-Christian meaning, and then implanting those new ideas, that new way of thinking, into the minds of new generations. And this is why egalitarianism has been described as a Christian heresy. But it's a Christian heresy in more than one sense. It's not simply a heresy in the sense that it rose out of Christianity through a distortion of Christian theology. It's also a heresy in the sense that it's now plaguing our churches. The re-engineered doctrine of the image of God, the genetically modified one, is harming us. Consider the way that these people use the doctrine of the image of God to justify policies and practices that are distinctively left-wing secular views. Take the issue of gender. Why do so many Christians now think that women should be treated the exact same way as men? It's because women are made in God's image. They're using this idea of God's image to flatten, to level, to override distinctions that Scripture itself makes and that nature makes. Take the issue of economic policy. Why do so many Christians now think that we should have a modern welfare system where we provide housing and education and health care and child care to all manner of people, including those who live immoral and irresponsible lives, who refuse to work even though they're capable of doing so? Why do we do that? Read their polemics, read their arguments. Often they'll say, because we're made in God's image. These people are still made in God's image, as if that somehow justifies it. How did you go from they're made in God's image to welfare? What? That's a huge leap of logic. Again, they're using the image of God to flatten, to level distinctions, critical distinctions. Why do so many Christians on the left think we should have open borders? So as to let the third world just pour in willy-nilly and to bring their culturally alien beliefs and customs with them, unassimilated. It's because, we're told, even immigrants are made in God's image. Here again, the imago Dei is used to flatten, to erase critical distinctions. Why do so many liberal churchgoers, many of whom identify as Christian, believe that the LGBTQ types should be allowed to openly live that way, to get married, to adopt children, to change their gender, and so on? You already know. Because they're made in God's image. You're going, wait, what? How did we get to this point of thinking that argument makes sense? It's because the doctrine got genetically re-engineered. It means something different to people now. The Christian left uses the imago Dei to justify what the Bible does not support and, in some cases, openly condemns. Perhaps the best example of all, though, of what I'm talking about is capital punishment. I've read a lot of the polemics from the liberal Christian church that opposes capital punishment over and over and over again. Guess what they argue? The murderer is made in God's image, therefore he ought not be executed. That's reversing the logic of Genesis 9. That the victim is made in God's image, and therefore the murderer must be executed. The image of God has been genetically re-engineered. It means something different to people now. It has different significance, different logical import to it. This doctrine is now being used as a bulldozer, as a steamroller, as a leveler by Christians. And we have to understand this. Prior to the modern age, the imago Dei, believe it or not, played a very limited role in Christian ethical and political thought. Now it's ubiquitous. Christians just think all you have to do is appeal to the image of God to prove whatever you want to prove. But back in the day, Christian thinkers relied on God's law in the form of commandments, on civil righteousness, which I talked about at length, on virtues, on vices, on what's socially beneficial or harmful as defined by a Christian moral worldview. The doctrine of imago Dei played a very small role in the moral worldview of Christian thinkers traditionally in terms of their political stance, their ethical stance. And that's partly because I think it plays a pretty minimal role in the Bible. This is wild to think about. If you went and listened to modern evangelical Christians talk about the image of God, you would think that it's in every book of the Bible, that it's one of the top themes in the Bible. We're made in God's image, therefore don't do this, don't do that. You guys, there are 2 verses in the 66 books of the Bible that use the image of God as a premise for deriving a normative conclusion, for deriving a commandment about how you should treat people. Genesis 9 and James 3. That's it. There's nothing about welfare. There's nothing about marriage. There's nothing about, all this egalitarian nonsense. It's not there. It's not in Scripture. But I want to end here by pointing out, guys, that we really shouldn't be surprised by this. The most pernicious errors are almost always going to be ones that clothe themselves in some kind of truth. That's the way it works. Counterfeit money. It's got to look like the real stuff. If it looks like monopoly money, you're not going to use that. It's got to look legit. Likewise, the reason why liberal Christian theology is so potent, so persuasive, so destructive is because it kind of looks biblical. We have to become discerning, guys. We have to become discriminatory. We have to learn how to make distinctions and to stand our ground. There's no other way to fulfill our duty to take thoughts captive to Christ. And that is our calling, to destroy these strongholds, these philosophies that have been set up against the knowledge of Christ.